The purpose of this video is to review the long essay, and all the information in this video comes from the AP Central website for American History Advanced Placement Exam. Okay, let's have an overview of what's going to be in this video. First, we're going to look at an expanded rubric. We're going to review a scoring rubric provided by AP Central, and then we're going to look at an example essay and how it's scored. The first thing that we're going to look at right here is the set of skills that the long essay wants the student to display. The student is given 35 minutes to write an essay in which the student will provide a thesis that is a defensible claim. It responds to all parts of the question. Also, historical thinking skills. One of the historical thinking skills will be asked specifically of a student, and in this case it's going to be periodization. And if you need to review those historical thinking skills, you can go back to the other video on American history skills that I also have posted. Support the argument with evidence using specific examples, and you fully substantiate or argue with them and provide explanation. And synthesis, and that's where you make a connection with your argument and one of another types of history from a different historical period, situation, era. Or maybe you can go back to those American history themes or an approach to history that is not the focus of this essay, like political, economic, social, cultural, or intellectual history, and make a connection there. Let's look at the sample questions. These are two of the sample questions from the 2015 APUSH long essay. And this particular video is going to focus in on question number 2, which is evaluate the extent to which the 7 Years' War marked a turning point in American relations. And then specifically they want you to apply the historical thinking skill of periodization. And you are directed specifically to analyze what changed and what stayed the same, and that's when we use that skill, periodization. This is the actual copy of the curriculum framework alignment on this particular skill, and I just wanted to show that to you briefly so you could see that this is a specific skill in the APUSH curriculum, and that skills that are targeted are periodization, argumentation, and synthesis. Here's the scoring guideline. The maximum points possible are 6. And I'm just going to briefly touch on these different skills, and please focus in on the underlined portions, the portions underlined in crimson. And I'm going to do this for time purposes because this video may get just too long, and I'm going to focus in on specific things. So first of all, we have a thesis, and it should respond to all parts of the question. Then argument development. This argument and development, you're going to get possible of 2 points, possibility of 2 points, and you're going to tell how the historical development is different from, similar to events before the time period, and similar and different to followed. So those are your 2 points, and we're going to look specifically at how this is used in the sample essay. Then we're going on to part 3, question with specific examples of relevant evidence, you get 1 point. And then another point, using specific examples effectively. And that means, and if you look at the very bottom of the page, that means that you have thorough analysis and explanation, not that you're just listing out a jumble of facts in support of your thesis. Last skill is synthesis. Synthesis is where the argument is extended and there's a comparison made to a different historical time period. And then this is the last part of that scoring rubric, and it talks a little bit about accuracy and clarity. It requires the students to demonstrate historically defensible knowledge. The essay can contain some errors, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And they should be considered first drafts, and sometimes there are some grammatical errors. They shouldn't be counted against the student, and sometimes that makes you feel a little better to know that. Okay, this is the actual flushed out scoring rubric that is given to people who score these exams, and I want to focus in down here toward the middle of the actual page for examples of acceptable thesis. And these are several that let you see how a student can develop a thesis, and that it will have more than one part and it will be specific. For some colonial groups, such as the elite, the 7 Years' War marked a turning point in relations, while for others, such as colonial common people, the relationships with Britain remain the same. So there's your periodization skills, different and the same in different eras. This war, to a great extent, marked a turning point in America and Britain due to change in economic policies, restrictions on expansion, and the limited preservation of trade relations with England. Notice the three-part thesis, that it is very specific. The student is telling us, I'm going to talk about economics, restrictions on expansion, and limited preservation of trade relations. And then finally, the last example, French and Indian War marked a major turning point in American relations. Changes such as increased British control, anti-British sentiment, and continuities such as loyalty to Britain that remain largely untouched by the war. So this last thesis actually focuses in on categories of change and gives a preview and divides that into subcategories: increased British control, anti-British sentiment, and continuities, things that stayed the same, such as loyalty to Britain. And some of this remained intact even through the war. So when you write your thesis, be sure that you're focusing in on the question, you're answering the question, that you're providing the reader the information that he or she needs to see, that you're actually answering that question, that you understand that you're doing periodization, that you're doing change and continuity, that you're talking about the 7 Years' War. It needs to be specific. And then at the top you see some examples of unacceptable theses, and I'll let you read through those and stop the PowerPoint so you can see the difference, that they're not focused, they're not specific, and they don't identify the task at hand that you are actually doing periodization. Part B, argument development. Remember that you are being asked to work and focus on similarities and differences, and I want to draw your attention to under Part A, argument develop, into the examples of acceptable descriptions of difference and similarities. And this student says the following is an example. Before the war, the American militias were responsible for safety. After the war, the safety of the colonists was in the hands of oppressive British government and its troops. That is a difference. And then similarities, both before and after. Officials attempted to place taxes on colonial goods. So you see that the student is very careful to specify the before and after relationships and to let the reader know exactly that, hey, this is what I know I'm supposed to be doing, and here's my information, and here's my argument and my actual evidence. Here's a little more information about those developments of the argument. Responses earn one separate point by explaining the extent to which American relations with Great Britain after the 7 Years' War were different from and similar to American relations with Great Britain before the war. So these arguments, the extent of the argument and the fact that the student can explain and provide strong evidence is what actually earns you that point. Again, it's not just regurgitating facts and listing them. Here is a little bit more information about acceptable explanations of similarity and differences, and you can read through those and see how the writer is careful to note and use the terms about the changes in policies, and also to talk about continuities and to be very specific. I like at the top, under acceptable explanations, the student using the term salutary neglect, and also in the second example, protests, and also talking about the issues with taxes and controlling trade, and these specific things that go on that had occurred. This is the next section, which deals with using evidence and effective substantiation. So let's look at a couple of examples here towards the middle. Evidence that could be used to argue the 7 Years' War was less important as a turning point in different areas: the attitudes of everyday colonists, transatlantic exchanges, long-standing transatlantic belief systems, republicanism, natural rights, enlightenment, Great Awakening, unchanging labor systems, slavery, Zenger trial, illustrating a growth of distinct colonial identity, and previous British policies of mercantilism. So this is some information that the readers say that you can look for in the essays in order to award points. And those are also ways that things remained unchanged. Then at the bottom of the page, the last bullet, evidence that could be used to argue there was a major turning point. Let's look at those. Taxation and efforts of Britain to assert greater control, British troops left in American colonies, the Standing Army, the Quartering Act, the Proclamation of 1763. These are all oppressive changes by the British government that came after the French and Indian War. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, to pay for the war debts. So this is the specific evidence that the readers want to see you use as you make your argument. And then the last part is synthesis. Again, we're going to look at the part A. Responses can extend their argument, explaining connections between their argument and a development in a different historical period, situation, era, or geographical era. And we're going to look at an example of that towards the end of the essay. And here's a few examples as well. Look at the middle of the page underneath examples of synthesis by connecting the argument to a development in a different historical period. The French and Indian Wars results similar to what took place in French Revolution later on. Debt from the war cost colonial independence from Great Britain. Debt from involvement in American Revolution helped inspire the French Revolution. So that's a good way to achieve that synthesis. And then there are some other examples that are provided to you, and you can stop the PowerPoint and look at those as well. Okay, so we're going to go forth now and look at an example essay from the 2015 test. This is an actual student essay, and I apologize for the small type, but I'd like for you to be able to see the actual scoring explanation next to the essay. I think it's beneficial. So it says here that the student achieved the thesis point, and the thesis that the 7 Years' War was a turning point, varying degrees in specific political, economic, and social ways. It can be proven and demonstrated with evidence throughout the essay. And so this is the thesis of the student, and then the student will go on, and you will see that I have underlined in the student copy in the dark crimson. This is that specific evidence that the student is going to use to make their point. Laissez-faire, salutary neglect, mercantilist manner, taxation without representation, virtual representation, and these are all specific evidence that the student uses to make their argument. Okay, so you see the thesis in the last sentence of the first paragraph, and the student jumps in on the first full paragraph, first full body paragraph, talking about Great Britain changing their economic policies and referring specifically to salutary neglect, mercantilism, taxation without representation, virtual representation. Moving forward, this is a little bit of information about the development of the argument. The student earned the point for both of those A and B parts. The response describes ways in which developments before the war were similar and different. The essay contrasts the situation before the war, when colonists' westward expansion was blocked by French power, and then blocked later with the Proclamation of 1763. And you see those items underlined in the body of the text. Also, another point, the response argues more similarities existed before and after the period in economic areas, British mercantilistic policies, and social developments, colonial desire to move westward, than in political areas where changes were accompanied by riots and British reactions. And we're going to look at that as well on the next page. Also, this is, again, you can see the underlined portions with mercantilism and the continuing to trade. And that was what we were just talking about, is that these were things that were the same before and after the war. And let's move on to part C on the scoring rubric. It says here that the student earned the point for using evidence. The student used a lot of evidence about the 7 Years' War before and after, taxes, the crises that go on that cause greater political change after the war, the trade and economic dependence as evidence for a smaller extent of economic change. We've talked about that. And then finally, the last part is synthesis. And sadly, this student did not earn any points for synthesis because the student did not really achieve a statement that was fully explaining or making that connection to another part of history, another historical era. It says the response comes close in the third paragraph to extending the argument by examining it through a different theme, like identity, but ultimately does not provide a specific way in which Native American experiences could be used to assess the extent to which relations changed between the colonies and Great Britain. So this student has done a good job in creating the argument. They had a clear thesis. They supported their thesis with evidence. They were clear about things that were similar and gave specifics. And they were clear about things that were different and gave specifics. So in summary, the long essay requires you to do basically 4 things. To provide that extended thesis that is clear and defensible. To, in this case, show what is different and similar before and after the war. In other words, this is periodization. What is the same, what continues, and what changes. Also, to be sure that sufficient evidence, fully analyzed and explained, is used to support your viewpoints of what was different and similar before and after. And then to provide that synthesis. And I always say a good place to remember to put in your synthesis is in your conclusion. A lot of students are looking around of how to conclude their essays. Well, that's a great place to do it. And so I like the example that was provided about the French Revolution, is that many times when nations get in debt and they begin to have to pursue these economic policies of taxation, which seem to give the people the sense that the government's becoming too big, too powerful, infringing upon their rights. This is a cocktail that normally leads to the rising up of the people to demand more protections, to demand their liberties and rights, to demand protection against these economic policies. And so that would be a good way to show synthesis, in that in 2 different nations, 2 different wars, the outcome is pretty much the same, is that when a nation goes to war, there are always taxes, and with taxes there are always cries from the public, and there are always attempts to rise up and make changes in order to prevent those issues. So good luck with your writing on the long essay.